Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is pry. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear pry used is to mean to ask questions and to seek information too closely into a person's private matters. So, with this first definition, what we're thinking about is someone who asks a great number of questions and questions that maybe are very personal in nature. So, not things that people just openly share. And so, that action of asking many personal questions can best be described with this verb. A second way you'll hear pry used is to mean to use force to move or open something. Sometimes you'll see people use certain tools as they try to get something to open. That comes to mind. Perhaps you think of kind of like a bar and someone really trying to pull or yank something open. A third way the verb pry gets used is to use force to separate something from something else. So again, with this, instead of trying to remove one thing, now we're really trying to push two things apart. You should know that pry is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, I'm going to add ing to form prying. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed, but I need to make a spelling change here because I have a word that ends with a consonant and a y. So before I add the suffix, what I'm going to do is drop the y, add an I, and then add ed. So we're going to pronounce this verb pride. Pride. Okay. We do have a couple phrasal verbs to look at. We'll start with to pry into. This ties back to the first definition we just talked about. So, inquiring means to ask questions. So, when we pry into something, we're closely inquiring about matters that maybe are private or secret in nature. An example of this might be, are you prying into my business affairs? Right? So maybe someone you don't work with is trying to get secret or private information. A second phrasal verb you might encounter is to pry off. Again, this is going to tie back to our third definition where we're removing or we're separating something. An example here. We pried off the rotting wood and replaced the boards. Okay, so here we're talking about removing wood from some particular location or thing in order to replace it. The last phrasal verb you might encounter is to pry out or pry out of. This can have a couple meanings. One would be to remove something from something else. And generally, we're talking about using a lot of force, a lot of strength to get the one thing removed from the other. What immediately came to mind was an example from the news. So my example sentence here is, Brandon Say pried the gun out of the killer's hands and saved countless lives. There was a really horrible tragedy in Monterey Park, California, a little over a week ago, where a lovely celebration of the Chinese New Year was unfortunately interrupted with a lot of violence. There was a man who killed 10 people. He went to a second location, many people believe to kill more people. But this incredible human being, Brandon, forcefully removed the gun from this person's hands. Incredible video of that. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at it. He is an incredibly brave human being. A second way we can use pry out of ties back to this idea of getting information. So we might be talking about either getting something or getting information from someone after giving it great effort or great persistence. So you continue to ask questions in hopes that you're going to get what it is, whatever it is you want. An example of this might be, can we pry the surprise details out of her? So perhaps something's being planned, someone's trying to keep it a bit secret, but someone else, maybe if we keep asking, keep being persistent with our questions, maybe we'll wear her down and she'll share the information. Now let's use our verb of the day, pry, in a couple different verb tenses. Today we'll practice the simple past tense and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the simple past tense. We use this verb tense to talk about actions that were completed at some known point in the past. And in these sentences, you might see time signals, words like yesterday, last week, in 2012, or other specific dates that are clearly in the past. The nice thing, I should mention though, not every simple past tense sentence is going to have a time signal. It could be implied as part of a conversation or maybe a longer passage that you're reading. So if I'm telling a story about something that happened yesterday, I don't have to keep saying yesterday, 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 even though I might be using the past tense in all of those sentences. Now let's talk about structure. To make an affirmative simple past tense sentence, I'm going to have my subject and then I'm going to have my ed form of the verb since this is a regular verb. And this is going to be my structure no matter what the subject is. It's going to stay the same. Here's an example sentence. The coach pried his athletes out of bed to begin workouts. I saw a sentence very similar to this. I think it was describing summer workouts where a team was sort of staying together, but it was like the coach had to forcefully get them to wake up and get out of bed. So they were, in this case, removing the athletes from bed. Now, if you want to make a negative simple past tense sentence, our structure will be to have our subject, then did not, then the base verb. And again, this is going to be the same pattern no matter what the subject is. Here's another example. Her new boss didn't pry into her personal life. Okay, so I will always like to point out to my students, notice in the negative here, I'm not using the ed form of the verb. Okay, so I went back to the base verb. Finally, let's look at yes or no questions in the simple past tense. To do this, I start with did, then I have my subject, and then the base verb. So again, in my yes or no question here, I'm not using the ed form. Here's another example. Did the burglar pry open the window? So here we might be talking about using a tool in order to force the window to open. Now let's talk about the present perfect progressive. Some students will know this as the present perfect continuous. They mean the same thing. Okay. We use this verb tense, present perfect progressive, to talk about actions that started in the past and continue into the present. Many times we're focusing on how long a particular action has been ongoing. I like calling this verb tense the present perfect progressive because you can see 3 P's in the name. And I like for my students to remember that the 3 P's tell us I need 3 parts to make this verb. So my structure is going to change a little bit based on what the subject is. So if my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have. Then I'm going to use the participle been, B-E-E-N. Then I use the ing form of the verb. Okay. Now my structure is a little different. If my subject is he, she, or it, I use has, been, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. People have been prying deeply to understand why the celebrity couple broke up. Okay. Now, I know some people get really excited and follow celebrity gossip and who is dating whom. And many times, maybe you've seen magazines, TV shows, internet blogs, etc., talking about these things. And many people might try and ask questions to understand why a particular couple is no longer together. Now let's look at negative present perfect progressive sentences. Again, we need to pay attention to our subject, and after that, we'll use has or have, whichever form matches our subject. Okay. Then we use not. Sorry, we got to make this negative. So have not or hasn't. Then been, the participle. Then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example sentence. The investigator hasn't been prying into the couple's tax returns. So here, not seeking additional information or seeking private information. Now let's look at present perfect progressive yes or no questions. To do this, we start with have or has, then we have our subject, then the participle been, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Have scammers been prying seniors out of their hard-earned savings? And the unfortunate answer to that is usually yes. There are new and different ways, but it does seem like there are some fairly evil people in this world that will try and cheat people out of their money. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words related to our verb pry. And the first word we're going to look at is just the noun form of this word. So sometimes people will use the word pry to refer to the tool, the object that is used in order to separate or remove something from another. You might also hear this called a pry bar, which is why I included that word there. An example of this might be, the man pleaded guilty to striking 2 victims with a metal pry bar. Right? This is, again, another sad sort of sentence to describe, but you might be able to sort of picture this. You might have seen things like this in TV shows, movies, etc. But generally are very heavy objects because it can take a lot of force to open things. Another related word you might hear is the noun prior. Okay. Here, P-R-I-E-R, notice that spelling change because of the suffix ER there. This is just referring to a person who pries, or maybe someone that seems overly curious, overly inquisitive. An example of this. Single people don't even need to give family, strangers, or any other priors the luxury of an explanation as to why they aren't married. Saw a sentence very similar to this, where somebody was sort of voicing how tiresome it can be for someone who's not married to hear constantly from people, why not? What about this person? Da, 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 right? And kind of that over interest, perhaps, in someone's personal thoughts, feelings, and their personal affairs. The last word we're going to look at today is the adjective prying. This generally means that someone or something is too inquisitive. They're asking too many questions, or they're too interested in something that is really private. An example of this. Please stop with these prying questions. Okay? If you heard somebody say that to you, right, you should absolutely stop asking very personal questions. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.